What's up, everyone? This is the first episode of the Pitre Podcast. God, this is so much work to set up. Anyone who's done a podcast before, setting it up visually, setting it up audibly is such a freaking hard and annoying process in our job. So before, I only did it audibly. So doing visually is such a pain in the ass. So shout out to everyone doing podcasts. I know the struggle, which I say that in sarcasm because it's not that hard at all for the most part. But yeah, this is the Pitre Podcast. Some of you might remember me. When I say some of you, I mean one of you. But basically, I had another podcast previous to this one, which was called R6 MMA Talk, the fight after the fight. Little long-winded, but it was pretty cool. That podcast centered around MMA. Ended around 2022, end of 2022. And the only topic I talked about on that podcast was MMA, but this is my new podcast. This has nothing to do with MMA. We're going to be going over a wide range of topics on this podcast. So when it comes to society, like, do we have an overemphasis on like, saving or, material spend, or what are my viewpoints on abortion, or how can we change, the homeless issue in America? So I'm going to be going over all those topics. And when I do pick a topic, I want to go over it in depth. So I don't want to just look at something very surface level. I want to go over it in depth to the best of my capabilities. I'm not going to be an expert in the subject whatsoever, so please don't expect me to be. I'm just a regular guy just trying to dive into these topics for regular people such as ourselves. But in going through these topics in depth, what I want to do, and the premise of my show, is to have a really centralized look or a centralized viewpoint of the topic. I feel like people nowadays, especially in our society, we are very polarized, whereas we think either extremely far to the left or we think extremely far to the right, where the answer is almost always in the middle. So I'm going to be playing devil's advocate a lot on my podcast when I'm going over these subjects. And personally, I'm like that just who I am. I'm always playing devil advocate and like trying to find, the pros and cons to everything. So I'm going to do the best of my capabilities to portray that when I'm covering these topics. So that's what to expect on this podcast. For this episode, I kind of just want to give you like the gist of this podcast and go over why I ended the other podcast. I never really gave an explanation on the final episode for R6 MMA Talk. And basically, the reason why I ended that other podcast was because in doing the MMA podcast, I kind of fell out of love with MMA. Which when doing my research on MMA podcasters, MMA material, that's something that tends to happen, which is kind of shocking. But basically, it just kind of became like a full-time job in a way, where I would watch UFC, I would watch Bellator and a few other MMA promotions, and I would cover those fights. Oftentimes, those fights are occurring on Friday and or Saturday. So every Saturday night, my entire night was taken because I was watching MMA. Or when all three of those promotions decided to have fights on one weekend, I have to watch 12 hours of MMA. Actually, even more than that. So I would watch everything twice. I would watch all the fights twice. The first time just as casual viewership. The second time to like really analyze and take notes. So I would end up watching MMA for like 15, 18 hours in one weekend, which it helped me in analyzing MMA and kind of like, really getting in depth with the sport. But dude, it's a lot of work for someone who's not getting paid for it. And on top of that, I had to cover other topics of stuff that's happening in the MMA sphere, like something that a fighter did, or like, MMA drama, or like things along those lines. So it was a lot of research, a lot of work, a lot of taking notes, a lot of getting in depth into the sport to do the podcast, and at the end of the day, still not get paid for it. So it kind of made me fall out of love with MMA. But not only that, an issue that I had with the podcast was that I could only speak about one subject. So there was things where I want to talk about, or I would like to talk about, but the premise of my podcast and our show was not that. So I couldn't really justify going into some of those subjects where people were tuning in just to listen to me talk about MMA. That would involve me creating a second podcast, which the first podcast was already hard to manage, working a full-time job and now doing that on the weekends. So imagine trying to do two now. It was going to be a lot. I was going to have no social life. My whole life would just be work and podcasting, which I didn't want. So I couldn't talk about other topics outside of MMA, which talking about the same topic over and over and over and over again, it really tires you out. Thankfully for MMA, there's basically fights on every single week. So there's like something kind of new that I can talk about. So I'm not talking about the same fights over and over and over again, but it's still the same subject and it does get tiring at the end of the day. So after doing it for an entire year, I decided to call it quits because I wanted to move on to other things to start my own podcast. I took a year off. Basically, life happened and now I'm back here. But I am thankful for R6 MMA Talk at the end of the day. Like anyone who viewed into that show, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, seriously, because I really put my all and my time and effort into that show. And I hope that it came across when I was talking about the subject of MMA. I did get some success from it, not much. When I say success, I mean very limited. I did have a good amount of viewers, I guess, for someone who did podcasting in their first year, which if you want to get into podcasting, basically the rule of thumb is no one's going to listen to you your first year, essentially. But I did get a good amount of listeners for someone who had only a audible podcast and not a visual podcast. So that was cool. Promotions like Invicta FC reached out to me to interview their CEO and some of their fighters. I did turn down the interview because I didn't want to interview fighters. But it was cool that, the largest women's MMA promotion in the world, a promotion where all of basically the UFC women's champions all come from Invicta. So it was really, really cool to have the opportunity to interview their champions, interview their CEO. There was a women's boxing champion who was coming into MMA for the first time. I forgot her name, but I had the opportunity to possibly interview her too. So it's cool that, they reached out to me in order to do that. Looking back on it, I probably shouldn't have taken the opportunity. If I can go back in time, I probably would have, to be honest, but bygones be bygones. Things are in the past, nothing we can do. But all in all, I'm thankful for R6 MMA Talk. It taught me a lot. It was fun while doing it. But I felt like I just had to come to a close of it 2 years ago because it wasn't enjoyable anymore. And when it comes to podcasting and you're not getting paid, if you start to not enjoy it, why even do it, to be honest, especially when you don't have that many listeners. There's not like a bunch of people depending on you fan wise. The whole point of podcasting is just like the flexibility to have fun, to talk about what you want. And if someone listens in, someone listens in. But yeah, that's the reason why I stopped the last one. I don't think I ever gave like a formal explanation to that. So again, if you tuned in and you listened to that podcast, whether it be for episodes upon episodes or just 5 minutes checking it out, dude, seriously, I am so thankful. I didn't expect anyone to listen to it. To the fact that I had people listening to it week in, week out, truly, it felt amazing. And recording that last episode kind of broke my heart. Like it was the closest to crying that I ever came in years. It just felt like I was letting people down who are tuning in every single week to listen. But with this podcast, definitely not going to happen. So now I have a wide range of topics to talk about and not just MMA. So I have some flexibility and I think this one's going to be a lot more fun than the last one. So yeah, just expect basically the unexpected with this podcast regarding topics. I promise I'm going to pick things that are relevant to most people or relevant to what's happening in society now. And of course, if there's an episode that you didn't necessarily vibe with or a topic that you didn't necessarily vibe with, you don't have to force yourself to listen to it. You could just tune in next week where I'm talking about a completely different topic. So basically, if you want to hear me talk and hear me ramble by myself, this would be the perfect opportunity to do so. But yeah, this is the first episode of the Pitre Podcast. I just want to let you guys know what's going to be going down moving forward and tune in for next week. Bye, guys.